Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into something critical, the situation in Ukraine, especially given the massive Russian air attacks just these past few days.
Yeah.
I mean, June 29th saw this bombardment, over 500 projectiles. The Ukrainians are calling it the largest airstrike of the war. Just staggering.
It really is. The scale is hard to comprehend.
And you saw the immediate reaction, right?
Yeah.
NATO scrambling jets. Poland's operational command even said their own planes and allied ones were up because the Russian attack was so intense.
A very clear signal.
So these aren't just news flashes. They force a really big question for Europe, for NATO. How do you actually deter this? How do you give Ukraine real security guarantees? We've pulled together, quite a few sources, defense experts, parliamentary research to try and unpack this.
Right.
And ultimately, we're looking at what seems like a huge shift, maybe, in European defense thinking, moving away from, say, traditional ground troops towards air defense, high-tech stuff, and what that could mean for everyone.
Exactly. Our mission today really is to pull out the key insights from all of this material. Look at the tough realities on the ground, the dilemmas Europe's facing trying to help Ukraine, and some pretty innovative ideas being floated.
Like SkyShield.
Like SkyShield, yeah. We'll get into that. And how it all ties into NATO strategy, defense spending commitments, that's crucial too. The core thing, I think, is that the brutal facts in Ukraine are forcing this maybe uncomfortable but necessary pivot. Admitting the limits of traditional ground forces and looking at air defenses, maybe a more pragmatic way forward.
Pragmatic and high impact, perhaps?
Potentially. So we'll explore what this all means for European security and, for you listening.
Okay, so let's start with that immediate reality. Ukraine under attack. What stood out to me about June 29th wasn't just the number, 500 plus, but the sophistication.
The mix, yeah.
A terrifying mix. Hundreds of those Shahed drones, but also Kinzhal hypersonic missiles. Really tough to stop those, right?
Extremely tough.
Yeah.
Fast, unpredictable flight paths.
Plus Iskander-M, KN-23 ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and they weren't hitting just one area. It was south, central, west Ukraine. Odesa, Lviv, Mykolaiv, Zaporizhia, Kremenchuk, a massive coordinated wave.
And the human cost. Just devastating. In Odesa alone, 2 killed, at least 17 injured. A drone hit a residential tower block.
Horrific.
Then 1 killed in Kherson, 6 injured in Cherkasy. And this isn't isolated. The UN reports, looking back from February 2022 to April 2025, these short-range drone attacks have caused over 3,000 civilian casualties.
3,000?
Yeah, 395 killed, over 2,600 injured. And the UN notes this looks like deliberate targeting of civilians just going about their day, which they say might be war crimes. April 2025 is actually the deadliest month on record for these kinds of attacks.
Yeah.
It's relentless.
Just relentless. But then you see Ukraine's response, that interception rate you mentioned earlier. They claim shooting down 475 out of 537 targets in that big attack, which is, incredible.
Astonishing, really. They're using everything direct firepower, missiles, but also electronic warfare, jamming, confusing the incoming threats.
But what are the sources saying about the cost of that defense, beyond the terrible civilian toll,
Well, it's immense. Tragically, a Ukrainian F-16 was lost during that defense. The pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Maxim Ustimenko, died. He'd apparently shot down 7 targets himself before being hit.
Wow. 7 targets.
Yeah. Heroic, but a terrible loss. And that's the 3rd Ukrainian F-16 reported lost in combat. Each one is a major blow, strategically and morally.
Right. And that loss, the cost, it feeds into this bigger dilemma for Europe, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. President Zelensky has asked for a 200,000-strong deterrent force from allies. But our sources are pretty clear. Europe has major manpower issues actually fielding that kind of force.
How so?
Well, look at the numbers. The entire French military, only about 200,000 active personnel. The British Army, fewer than 75,000.
So, 200,000 from Europe alone.
It's just not feasible with current structures. One source bluntly calls it asking for imaginary soldiers. The numbers simply aren't there without a radical, probably politically impossible change like mass conscription.
And it's not just the numbers, is it? There are huge political, economic hurdles. A big, permanent ground force needs tons of equipment, people, boosted defense production, maybe even conscription, like you said.
Exactly. And that's politically toxic in many places,
Yep.
especially, with populist and right-wing parties on the rise in some countries. And the public. Well, one source mentions they might balk at sacrificing the welfare state to fund rearmament.
Yeah, imagine trying to sell cutting social programs to buy more tanks or bring back the draft. It's a tough sell, a really tough conversation for governments. It hits core debates about what a nation should prioritize.
Precisely. And if you can't field that big force, what about a smaller one? Well, the sources warn it risks being just a speed bump, not a real deterrent.
A tripwire, maybe, but not much more.
Right. And then there's the casualty question. What happens in a sort of semi-war scenario if there's an accidental missile strike on a European barracks? The risk of escalation is huge.
So it's not just about boots on the ground, but the potential political fallout if those boots are hit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's fascinating because, Kyiv might logically prefer troops on the ground as the strongest signal of commitment. But, as one analysis puts it, soldiers that are never sent from armies that exist only on paper signal failure.
So the commitment looks hollow if it's not credible.
Exactly. Which leads to the fundamental question. If large ground forces aren't really the answer right now, what is?
Okay, so facing that problem, this group of experts, European and American, they've proposed something called SkyShield, an integrated air protection zone. What does that actually involve?
Well, the idea is to use European air power. Dozens of combat aircraft, maybe up to 120, operating from existing bases in Europe, not Ukraine.
Okay, so flying from Poland, Romania, places like that.
Presumably, yes, existing NATO bases. And their job would be to protect uncontested areas of Ukraine, think cities, infrastructure, hundreds of kilometers away from the front lines from those Russian missile and drone attacks.
So basically, extending an air defense umbrella over parts of Ukraine flown by European pilots from European bases.
That's the concept. It's a pivot away from the ground troop problem, trying to leverage Europe's technological edge in air power.
And the argument is this would be more effective than ground troops.
The proponents argue it could have greater military, political, and socioeconomic impact than 10,000 European ground troops. By protecting civilians, protecting critical infrastructure, it frees up Ukraine's own military resources to focus on the front. And it sends a very clear signal to Moscow.
A signal of capability and resolve, but using a different tool.
Exactly. Using a strength Europe actually has readily available.
That does make sense strategically. It plays to strengths, high-tech air forces, existing bases, less manpower intensive than a huge ground deployment.
Right. It avoids those massive infrastructure costs, the logistical nightmare of putting large forces in Ukraine, and crucially, it sidesteps some of that casualty question we talked about.
Because the planes are based outside Ukraine and hopefully engaging threats before they cause casualties on the ground.
That's the idea. And the confidence for this seems to come partly from things like NATO's Baltic Air Policing mission. They've been intercepting Russian aircraft routinely, non-hostile intercepts mostly, since 2004.
Okay, so there's a precedent for managing these air encounters without it blowing up?
There's a precedent for close interaction, yes. It suggests these eyeball-to-eyeball moments in the air don't automatically have to lead to hostilities, if managed carefully.
But there are risks, surely.
Oh, absolutely. Even the supporters acknowledge that. They stress the need for very firm rules of engagement. And you have to be ready for the possibility, however unlikely they think it is, of actually engaging Russian fighter jets that might try to interfere.
So why are they confident Russia wouldn't directly fight these European jets?
Well, the thinking seems to be that directly engaging NATO air power, even if it's operating over Ukraine under this specific mission, would cross a huge red line for Moscow. It risks dragging NATO in directly, something Russia likely wants to avoid given the alliance's overall strength.
I see. So it's a calculated risk based on perceived Russian red lines.
Yes. And look, everyone admits ground troops do physically hold ground. They signal maybe a deeper kind of commitment. But SkyShield is being presented as a pragmatic, high-impact alternative, given the real-world constraints on providing those ground troops. It's about what's achievable and effective now.
This whole shift in thinking, this adaptation, it's happening just as NATO itself seems to be undergoing a major rethink. The summit in The Hague, June 24 to 26, 2025, that sounds pretty pivotal.
Very much so. Sources are saying the core deliverable from The Hague will be a major commitment to ramp up defense spending across the alliance. The goal, a stronger, fairer, and more lethal alliance.
Stronger, fairer, more lethal. Sounds serious.
It reflects a serious shift. This isn't just about Ukraine anymore. It's a fundamental reassessment of collective security in light of Russia and also looking towards China. And
the spending targets are ambitious, right?
Hugely ambitious.
Yeah.
NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte is talking about a quantum leap in capabilities. Allies are expected to commit to reaching, get this, 5% of GDP on defense-related spending by 2032.
5%. Wow. How does that break down?
It's 3.5% for what they call core military requirements.
Yeah.
Troops, equipment, readiness. And another 1.5% for related things like military infrastructure, boosting defense industrial capacity, R&D.
That's a massive jump from the old 2% target.
It is. Remember, the Wales pledge back in 2014 was to hit 2% by 2024. And actually, 23 allies did meet or exceed that in 2024. So this new 5% goal by 2032, it's a whole different level of commitment. The direction is clear. More money, more capability, more burden sharing.
Speaking of burden sharing, this is the first NATO summit since President Trump took office again. What's the U.S. angle here?
Well, U.S. officials, like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, are really emphasizing the need for a stronger, more viable NATO. And for them, that directly translates into pushing allies strongly to boost their defense investments, to share the load more equitably.
So the U.S. push for more allied spending continues.
Yes, but the framing, according to our sources, is not against NATO, but against a NATO that does not have the capability that it needs to deter threats effectively. So it's presented as being for a stronger alliance, which requires more investment from everyone.
It sounds like there's a convergence then. European anxieties driven by Ukraine, the U.S. push for burden sharing, all leading towards higher spending and maybe new strategies like SkyShield.
That seems to be the picture emerging.
Yeah.
A unified, more robust defense posture is seen as the only real path to stability long term.
Okay, so let's try to sum up this deep dive. We've seen how the awful realities in Ukraine, especially these massive air attacks, are really forcing Europe and NATO to rethink defense.
Fundamentally rethink.
Moving away maybe from the idea of large European ground troop deployments because of the practical difficulties we discussed towards potentially more agile, tech-focused solutions like this SkyShield air defense concept.
A concept that plays more to current European strengths, perhaps. And this strategic shift is happening right alongside a huge renewed push for dramatically increased defense spending across NATO.
Driven by a shared and, frankly, growing sense of the threats out there.
Exactly. A shared understanding that a stronger, better funded, more capable defense is urgently needed.
So the final thought for you, listening, what really strikes you about this idea of Europe stepping up with something like SkyShield, taking on that kind of air defense role? Does it feel like a new chapter in European security, maybe more self-reliant? Or is it just a necessary, pragmatic adjustment to a world where the old ways aren't quite cutting it anymore?
And how could this big push for more defense spending, that 5% target, how might that genuinely reshape the Atlantic alliance, the balance of power, in the years ahead?
Definitely something significant to think about. We'll leave it there for this deep dive.